If you follow any sort of content online related to trauma or healing therapy, you have likely come across conversation or few related to a paper that came out about polyvagal theory. And I think it's important to talk about what this means in a broader context for those on a healing journey, not just as it relates to polyvagal theory, but any sort of theories and practices, therapy that people experience. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. I'm not going to get into the specifics of the paper a whole lot, but just a little bit of foundation in case you're not really familiar with what's happened, if you're not necessarily hearing things, because this does apply to kind of the field of psychology more generally. So this paper, from my understanding, by 39 experts, is saying that the understanding that is talked about in polyvagal theory, really, what's happening in the body, how your nervous system is responding, what your vagus nerve is doing, all of that sort of thing. These people are saying that the mechanisms are not necessarily accurate, doesn't align with what science is saying. They're not necessarily talking about whether there's benefit in it. They're not talking about any of the practices. They're not even saying that the ideas necessarily in how to help people are wrong. They're just saying that the science that they're talking about, what's happening physiologically in our bodies, is not necessarily accurate. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind. Within the field of psychology, from the beginning of when the field began, there are always new theories, new pieces of awareness, new understandings that we have about how we as humans, how our mind works, how our body is affected, and what is helpful in those aspects. And that's natural and that's normal. It's good that as we continue to learn more, because we want to continue to learn as much as we possibly can, that as we learn more, ideas begin to shift. What we may have thought was helpful at one point, because of the ways that we can understand things now, we may recognize that maybe it's not as helpful, or maybe there's something that's more helpful. So that is important. And when it comes to mental health and psychology and therapy in particular, there are things that have been observable over time, things that have been studied that people can say, this is effective for this thing. And then there's other things that are really beneficial in the field of therapy that don't necessarily have a lot of definitive observable data that we can look at and say, yes, this is effective, or no, this is not effective. Certainly it exists, but not so much. Like CBT has been very thoroughly studied. EMDR has been thoroughly studied, but I think mostly in more recent adult single incident traumas. And then there's therapies that are kind of similar to those that have a little bit of an offshoot that somebody came up with. So recognizing that whatever model of therapy somebody might be practicing, there are going to be people on the other side who are critical of it for some reason or another. And sometimes that criticism is incredibly valid and important to recognize. And often that criticism is not so much about whether it can be beneficial to some people, or even black and white in terms of wrong and right, or yes, it works, or no, it doesn't. It's a different way of looking at things. It's a different understanding of things. And for people experiencing therapy or looking for a type of therapy that they want, it can be incredibly confusing. Recently, I did a video after there was some new information that came out, or additional, newer information that came out about internal family systems. Now, there are a lot of people who find internal family systems quite beneficial as therapists, and also people receiving internal family systems therapy. But there are people who believe that, for a variety of reasons, that it's not particularly efficacious and can potentially be harmful in some ways. What ultimately matters, generally, not just about polyvagal theory, what ultimately matters is, are you finding it beneficial? Because what works for one person is not going to work for some other people, or even what works for a lot of people isn't going to work for everybody. There's going to be a group of people, sometimes a larger group of people, maybe a subgroup of people, a specific type of subgroup for which it isn't going to work. And again, the reasons could be many, but that is the reality, because we are all different. We all have our own lived experiences beyond the single thing that we might be seeing somebody for. So even people that have experienced childhood trauma, there's going to be other factors that play into their experience of the trauma, the impact of the trauma, what healing is necessary, or what types of things need to be focused on for healing, based on a number of things. And so as therapists, we have to be able to have the ability, this goes a little bit with something I talked about recently, but we have to have the ability to understand that nuance. So if a therapist is learning about polyvagal theory, or they're learning and getting training around EMDR or internal family system, somatic therapy, whatever it might be, the therapist needs to understand the why and the how. A client does not necessarily need to understand all the intricacies. They don't need to understand on a cellular level what's happening in our body. For example, antibiotics. There's generally a consensus that antibiotics are effective for bacterial infections. We as a consumer, as a patient, we don't need to actually understand all the things that are happening in our bodies. We don't need to understand what's happening from the moment we take that antibiotic and how it's working to get rid of that bacteria, how it's working to kill that bacteria, how our body and our systems are working to combat it and work with the antibiotic and all of that. We don't need to understand that. Our doctors don't even necessarily have to understand all of that. They have to understand to a degree why an antibiotic over something else, or why a specific antibiotic is more effective for certain types of things. They need to understand that, but they don't need to understand all of the little intricacies of how and why it's working. And the same is true for therapy, whether it is cognitive behavioral therapy that has a lot of science behind it, a lot of evidence behind it working. The reality is that it is quite effective when used in ways that incorporates other types of things for most struggles that people have. I am a huge believer in cognitive behavioral therapy. However, I also fully recognize and understand that cognitive behavioral therapy is an aspect. It's one piece of the complex, layered puzzle of both the impact and the healing of childhood trauma. I also really subscribe generally to relational therapy, which I do think is important no matter what somebody is seeing a therapist for. So that kind of is a overarching kind of foundational aspect of how I think about what therapy does and how it works and why it's important as a framework. And the same is true for cognitive behavioral. Like, I don't sit down with people, I never have, either as a therapist or now as a mentor. I don't sit down and tell people that we're doing cognitive behavioral therapy. I didn't tell people what's going to happen in this cognitive behavioral therapy. I talked about helping them understand the automatic thought process and how beliefs are formed and different aspects that aren't specific to cognitive behavioral therapy, but are kind of similar, have some similar components to that. So even with somatic therapy, there's a lot of science behind how our bodies respond not only to trauma, but to a variety of things, and how we can calm our bodies down, right? How we can breathe after intense exercise to help calm our nervous system, how to help our heart rate return to normal. There's a lot of different things that we can understand that can make sense and that we can do that can be beneficial, even if we learn down the road that what's actually making something beneficial is different than what we might have thought before. So in particular, like with polyvagal theory, there are some things, and I think polyvagal theory and people doing therapy from that theory, part of, I think, what can be a little bit challenging, or why this is maybe pretty important with this theory in particular, is that a lot of just regular everyday people are learning things about polyvagal theory, and how they're learning it sometimes is very real, maybe even academic, important information. However, a lot of people learn things from spaces, from people that may not necessarily fully understand it. And so how they speak about it or what they're saying may not be the full picture. It may be a misunderstanding on their part that they're then relaying to other people. So there can be some challenges in that regard. And I'm not necessarily talking about therapists specifically, but if the science in something is not necessarily accurate, as therapists, if we are sharing what's happening on a physiological level in our body and it's not accurate, then we need to be able to correct that as we understand that it's not necessarily accurate. So, for example, a couple of things with polyvagal theory that are fairly commonly spoken about out there in the wild. For example, humming is one of the things that is talked about as a practice that you can do for kind of calming your nervous system. If it works for you, then there's no harm in doing it. Really, like, there's no harm in it. Humming is something people have done probably from the beginning of time. It's fine to hum. And if you find it beneficial, that's all that matters, because there isn't going to be harm that is done to you. If you go to a therapist who is going to help you heal trauma and they don't understand trauma and they try to get you to talk about your trauma, that has the potential to be harmful. We don't want that. That is not a good idea. But when it comes to the things that are most talked about when it comes to polyvagal theory, most of it is not going to be harmful. If a breathing technique or splashing your face with cold water feels helpful to you, it's not likely going to harm you. And so that can be, if that works, then it works. If you find somatic work helpful and it comes out that, oh, this doesn't really work, the science doesn't make sense, well, if it's been beneficial to you, then it's been beneficial to you. Now, if they say this particular technique might be more beneficial, then it might be worth giving that a try, but it doesn't make it wrong that you're doing this other thing. And when it comes to people healing from childhood trauma, I've talked about this many times. One of the challenges is that because we are all different and we're in different stages of healing, we're in different stages of acceptance, and we're in different places in terms of support and even what we have the capacity for. So one of the things that can often happen is that people will hear about this new technique or something, and everybody's praising it, and it's like this miracle cure. And you want to try it, and whether you try it on your own or you go to a therapist who specializes in it, you try it and maybe you're not finding the same type of benefit that other people have, or maybe you find that it actually is making you feel worse. Obviously, that's not good. We don't want that to happen no matter what. But what happens on a psychological level so often is that people will think that there's something wrong with them. Either they're not trying hard enough, they're not deserving of healing, they must not be strong enough, it just isn't meant for them. And that I think is one of the biggest problems, because in that thought process, it's reinforcing the beliefs that you've held on to for a really long time. It's reinforcing the very beliefs that create the circumstances in your life, whether it's coping mechanisms or isolating or anything in between. It's reinforcing what created those things. It's reinforcing the beliefs that you hold that make you believe that those are the best things for you. So it can keep you from being able to seek out the help that you need, to try a different type of therapy or therapist. And it just reinforces so much that idea of not being deserving, not being good enough. So whatever type of therapy you may do, there may even be a time that you feel like it's beneficial, and then a time that it may not feel that way. And that is natural, because the reality is, and I've talked about this many times as well, when it comes to healing from childhood trauma, because it is so complex, because it affects every part of our being, every layer of who we believe we are and what that means for how we show up in the world and the choices that we make. All choices, from the kinds of relationships we have in our life, to whether we choose to be in partnership or not, what kind of work we might end up doing or not doing, whether it can even affect people's desire to have children. I want to be clear that I am not saying that everybody should want to have children. Not saying that at all. But I have known personally, unfortunately, quite a few people who have said that they don't want children because they're afraid that they will do to their child what happened to them, that because they were abused, they will abuse their child. And we don't want those beliefs reinforced. We don't want those fears reinforced. So all the choices that we make is a result of those layers. So when it comes to healing from childhood trauma, no singular therapy, type of therapy, is going to get you from A to Z. A particular type of therapy may get you from A to B or A to E, but it's not going to get you to Z. And it's not even that we need to experience all the different types of therapy to ultimately get to Z, because it's not about that at all. It's that any singular method does not have the capability within its practices, within its understanding even, to get us ultimately to where we want and deserve to be. So from my viewpoint, so again, from the beginning, when I was working with survivors in a rape crisis center or even in a children's home before that, but even in private practice as an actual therapist to now as a mentor. As I learned about therapy and I really began to understand how we are affected by things, because that's really kind of what drove me into the field of psychology and social work as well. I wanted to understand. And I know some things sometimes we cannot understand, but I really wanted to understand. And so through that, as I understood different things and I read about different theories and practices, I would think about it in regards to, okay, this makes sense in this regard. It's kind of like cognitive behavioral therapy. Even though I didn't fully have the breadth of understanding that I do now, there were things about it that I thought made sense, but there were also some things about it that I thought, but I know it's not, we can't just replace our thoughts. We can't just think something different because we now know that we need to think something different. Like it just kind of didn't make sense to me. So it kind of made me think more about, why do we think this way? Where did this come from? And so I kind of did my own explorations around that. But as we learn as therapists about different types of therapy, there's going to be some things about lots of different types of therapies that have a framework to help us understand things better in new ways. And then there's going to be things that for the people that we work with may not necessarily apply as much. And I think one of the challenges with probably really over the last couple of decades has been that so many of these newer or more expanded theories and types of therapy come out. The majority of them, if not all of them, often talk about this being the treatment for trauma. And I think that there can be some challenges with that, in part because there's a huge difference between complex childhood trauma, especially trauma that's ongoing, and a singular event that's traumatic that an adult might experience, no matter what that trauma might look like. Not that one is worse or better than the other. It's not about that. But the impact, the layers in which we are affected, the complexity of it is much different for a person who's experienced ongoing childhood trauma than somebody who experienced something in their adult life one time. And oftentimes, I think even within professionals, sometimes there hasn't been enough distinction between the two. And this is why when I talk about finding somebody, I always emphasize that you look for somebody who has experience, that they specialize in, that they have expertise in working with survivors of childhood trauma, specifically, not just trauma, childhood trauma. And that they don't use I've used EMDR a lot as an example of that, because one singular type of therapy is not going to heal all of those layers. So what might be helpful, and much of the research that has been done around EMDR, and this may be changing a little bit, I haven't kind of kept up with it too much, but much of the research that was done, at least up to, I don't know, maybe time flies at this point, I don't know, at least a decade ago, so earlier on, much of the research was about more singular incident trauma for adults. And then it was just applied to trauma generally. Now, there are people who say that it is very beneficial for complex trauma. But regardless, even if that is true, I don't necessarily believe that it is, but even if that is true, it can still only get you to a certain place, because there are so many different things that need to happen when it comes to healing from childhood trauma. So when you're on this journey, if you are seeing somebody, for example, that does EMDR, or you're seeing somebody who does internal family systems, or somebody who does CBT or DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, or CPT, cognitive processing therapy. There's so many. It's so confusing. I know. And that's why I often don't necessarily talk about or even suggest looking for somebody that does specific types of therapy, because one isn't going to get you there, and how the person does it can make a difference. There's just a lot of factors that go into it. What's most important is that the person understands both the impact, so all of the complexity of the impact of what it means to be a survivor of childhood trauma, and the complexity of what it means to heal from childhood trauma. That is what is most important. And if you are doing any specific type of therapy, if you're doing any specific practices and you find it beneficial to you, there's no reason to stop doing it. Like, I can't think of a specific thing. As long as you find it helpful to you, truly find it helpful to you. Because I imagine there's some things that people might do that are probably not good for them, that could be harmful. But there's probably a part of you that's thinking, I don't know if this is a good idea. So just kind of keep that in mind. And I think it's also important, kind of along that similar thinking, that your intuition is something to pay attention to. If something doesn't feel like it's working for you, even if it seems to work for so many other people, it's important to honor that. And if you're in therapy, talk to your therapist about that. Like, I'm not quite sure that this is really working, or I'm not, instead of feeling this that I thought I would feel, or that this kind of therapy is supposed to make you feel, I'm noticing that I'm feeling this. And I know it can be hard to talk to your therapist about it in that way, but it's really important. That's part of your healing, being able to trust yourself, to honor what is happening for you, and ask for what you need, to explore. Is there something that maybe isn't working in that? Is there something that you could do differently? Is there a new way of thinking about it? All of those things are really important. So whether we're talking about a specific type of therapy like polyvagal or internal family systems, or we're talking about just generally therapy or practices that you're engaging in, or whether you're with a coach, or maybe you've gone on this psychedelic healing experience, or whatever it might be, it's important that you're trusting yourself and recognizing that no matter what it is, and I know I keep repeating this, but this is so important, no matter what type of therapy it is, there are going to be other pieces of information, other ways of understanding, other practices that are going to be important to get you all the way to Z. Doesn't mean that any particular thing is necessarily bad or wrong or absolutely can't work. It's just that it's not going to do all the work. And part of the reason that I think that that's so important to really take in is because what I've seen happen quite often is people will go, EMDR, I'm using that as an example because it's often for like a specific number of sessions that people will do. And so they'll finish their sessions and think that they're healed. And they might even feel a big sense of relief. They might feel like there's a shift that's happened, but then things will start to kind of creep back in. The beliefs will creep back in. The physiological responses and activation will creep back in. Those beliefs haven't necessarily gone anywhere, right? So they will likely come back in. And people will then blame themselves. They'll take that as evidence that they cannot heal, that therapy doesn't work. And therapy can work. Not all therapy will work. But most importantly, even really good therapy takes time. It takes repetition. It takes being able to integrate on a physical level how your body responds to different types of things. That shifts as you continue to integrate. That can only happen with practice over time. And some of it can happen relatively quickly, but we're talking about getting to Z, and that takes some time. And it doesn't have to be all at once. It can be periodically. Like you might do some sessions or with EMDR. You might even do that over a fairly long period of time. And then you stop for a while. And then maybe you go back another time and try something a little different. And that is very reasonable. But people who specialize in working with survivors of childhood trauma, I believe, obviously my opinion, they really need to be able to incorporate a lot of different pieces. I don't talk about my work from any particular framework. I don't say, let's do some somatic work. I don't say, let's do cognitive behavioral work or anything like that. Because it's all just so natural and organic based on what is coming up, what we are talking about, what we're processing on that particular day, what is important to understand maybe about what's going on. So people that work with childhood trauma need to have, I think, multiple frameworks that we draw from to help people heal. So I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts about it? Have you noticed some of that conversation, and what did it mean for you? What did it bring up? And remember that whether it's an older theory or a new theory that comes up, there is going to likely be some people who are going to be critical of it. And that criticism is generally going to be quite important. That's how kind of science and real depth of understanding, like really understanding, we need that in order to be able to continue to grow our ultimate knowledge and understanding of what is actually happening. So I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments. Let me know what came up. Thanks so much for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.